Today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Teen Wolf Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins in the dead of night in the town Beacon Hills, where police with dogs combed through the woods on high alert and ready for action. A high school teenager named Scott lived near the woods. He was alerted right then, and the visit from his best friend Stiles gave him quite a scare. Stiles' father was the town's sheriff, so he was privy to police operations and came to inform Scott that a girl's torso had been found in the town. The police were now searching for the other half. Stiles had come to invite Scott to join in on the thrill of the search. After entering the woods, Scott, who suffered from asthma, continuously complained that Stiles wasn't waiting for him. Unexpectedly, they ran into the police and Scott hid while Stiles was taken away by his father. Feeling overwhelmed, Scott decided to head back. The forest was silent and dark, and his adrenaline faded to a chill. On his way back, a startled herd of deer knocked him down, and he lost his asthma inhaler. Using the dim light from his phone, Scott searched for his inhaler, but shockingly stumbled upon the missing upper half of the girl's body. The gruesome sight terrified him, sending chills down through his spine to his butt and causing him to roll into a ditch. Getting up, Scott noticed a huge wolf nearby, its eyes gleaming coldly. It leaped at him, knocking him down, mistaking him for a sexy lady wolf. In a fierce struggle, Scott was bitten in the abdomen, but unfortunately not his smelly part. The pain unleashed his hidden potential, allowing him to roll away and make a desperate escape. He almost got hit by a car as he burst out of the woods, but the wolf didn't follow. Scott quickly checked his wounds, finding a row of bite marks, a shocking and painful reminder of his ordeal. Scott kept the incident from his family and treated his wound alone. The next day he went to school as usual, enduring the routine humiliation from the lacrosse team captain, Jackson. But he was used to it by now. Stiles, learning of his friend's ordeal last night, insisted that there couldn't possibly be wolves in the town, as there had been no wolf sightings in California for over 60 years. Scott, considering the darkness of the night, began to doubt his own experience. The small town was abuzz with the case of the girl's body. The teacher urged the students to focus on their studies, mentioning that the police had detained a suspect before starting the lesson. Scott was startled by a ringtone during class and looked around to see who dared to not silence their phone. He realized that nobody else seemed to hear it. When the call was answered, he heard a clear female voice and pinpointed that it was coming from a girl on the street, even though she was far away. Listening to her conversation, Scott learned she was a new transfer student who had forgotten to bring a pen. The girl named Allison was led into the classroom and sat behind Scott, who immediately offered her a pen. Allison thanked him, surprised and impressed, while Scott could hardly contain his hormone urges. Allison had only just started school when she received a warm welcome from the campus beauty Lydia. This baffled another classmate who couldn't understand how Allison had so quickly become part of Lydia's exclusive circle. Perplexed, she asked Scott and Stiles how Allison had managed to penetrate the popular group so soon. Stiles explained that Allison was strikingly hot, and it's typical for beauties to stick together. He jokingly suggested the classmate should perhaps look within herself for answers. From a distance, Scott overheard their conversation. He felt relieved when he learned Allison had turned down an invitation to a party from Jackson, pleased she wasn't just another superficial girl. Knowing that Allison was going to the lacrosse game sparked something in Scott. Previously, he had only been a substitute on the bench, but this year he was determined to make the starting lineup. However, reality was harsh. The coach only wanted him as a practice player, which was painfully clear when a whistle during practice felt like a thunderclap, leaving Scott with a headache. During practice, however, Scott effortlessly caught every ball as if by instinct, earning admiring glances from the girls watching. Jackson couldn't stand seeing Scott steal the spotlight and tried to challenge him aggressively, but Scott skillfully blocked him. The crowd cheered loudly. Even Lydia, Jackson's girlfriend, applauded Scott, which only fueled Jackson's resentment. A rivalry was certainly brewing. After school, Scott and Stiles ventured back into the forest. Scott was amazed by the changes in himself, but also slightly worried. He feared that the wolf bite might have infected him with a virus, like something out of a zombie apocalypse, enhancing his abilities while potentially harming his body. Stiles teased him about a special kind of infection that causes one to howl like a goose on the full moon. Annoyed, Scott pushed Stiles away. Searching the area, Scott realized both the inhaler and the girl's body were gone. Suddenly, a muscular man appeared behind them, questioning their presence on his private property. After learning they were just looking for something, the man tossed Scott his inhaler and left. Stiles later recognized the man as Derek, whose family had tragically died in a fire 6 years ago, and who had now returned. Later that night, while working at a pet store, Scott discovered his wound had already healed, a mere day after being bitten. The cats in the store were on edge, as if sensing a threat, causing chaos. At that moment, Allison arrived in a panic, having accidentally broken a dog's leg. Scott calmed the distraught Allison and checked on the dog, which growled at Allison, its perceived enemy. Scott's presence with his changing eye color intimidated the dog into submission. The two shared laughs while caring for the dog, and under Scott's watch, the dog let Allison pet it, which was a humiliating defeat for the dog. Allison petted the dog and he petted Allison, bold but respectful. Scott was quite the charmer. Gathering his courage, he asked Allison out, and she happily accepted. The day ended beautifully under a full moon, and Scott went to sleep full of anticipation. However, when he woke up again, he found himself sleeping in a cave. The morning fog wrapped around the mountain forest, and he vaguely saw a wolf, which also noticed him. Scott ran wildly, with the wolf keeping pace alongside him. Eventually, Scott jumped into a pond. After surfacing, he frantically searched for the wolf, but found himself in someone's backyard instead. The homeowner stared at him dumbfounded as Scott stood there bare-chested, having trespassed into someone's home. He was lucky they didn't greet him with a gun. After arriving at school, Jackson stormed up to him, unable to believe his excellent performance and angrily demanding to know where Scott had bought stimulants. After the morning's events, Scott was equally furious and blurted out everything about his changes, but Jackson gave him a look as if he were insane, unable to believe his bullshit. The tryout began, and the starting lineup was to be selected. Just before Scott went on the field, Stiles rushed to him, having sneaked a look at the police lab results with a shocking discovery. But Scott didn't wait to hear him out and went on to the field. The coach, in an attempt to motivate the players during his pre-game talk, bluntly hinted that winning the game might make their girlfriends love them more. Fired up, as if injected with adrenaline, the game became Scott's stage. His movements were swift and precise, his maneuvers during the game as graceful as gymnastics. The coach halted the game and seriously asked Scott how he managed those moves, then immediately congratulated him on making the starting lineup. Everyone cheered for the underdog's victory. However, Stiles looked worried. The lab results confirmed there were indeed wolves in the forest, and after being bitten, Scott seemed superhuman. The jokes they once made might actually be true. Stiles began researching werewolves, finding legends that matched Scott's situation. He called Stiles to share his findings and theory. He was bitten by a werewolf, but Scott was impatient, focused on his date with Allison. Stiles listed his incredible performance on the field, questioning how a newbie could achieve that. Harsh but true words. Scott lost his patience and wanted to leave, but Stiles stopped him, reminding him that tonight was a full moon. Scott panicked. His life was finally turning around, making the starting team and dating a hot girl. But Stiles told him that he was cursed, and the moon would not only change his body, but also make him bloodthirsty. Stiles tried to cancel the date for Scott, which infuriated him, nearly leading to a physical altercation. Scott eventually stormed off, venting his anger on a chair. After calming down, Scott apologized and left, prioritizing his love life over his friendship. A distressed Stiles stood up the chair only to see wolf claw marks on the back, a sign of Scott's transformation. Scott headed home first to freshen up. His mother knew right away from his appearance that he must have had a date with a girl. Handing him the car keys, she gave him some reminder, saying that she didn't want to be looking after a pregnant 16-year-old. Later, Scott picked up Allison and they went together to a classmate's party. However, an uninvited guest appeared at the party, the mysterious man Derek, who exuded an intimidating presence just by standing quietly. A fierce dog that glanced his way immediately fell silent and trembled. Scott made eye contact with him but got distracted, and soon Derek was nowhere to be seen. Scott's sharp senses caught a glimpse of a wolf darting across the rooftop. Indeed, it was a full moon night. While dancing in TikTok style with Allison, Scott's heartbeat accelerated. His head throbbed painfully, and a heat surged through him, awakening a bloodthirsty urge to tear beauty apart. Ultimately, he unceremoniously ditched Allison and drove home in disarray. At that moment, Derek showed up and started chatting up Allison, claiming to be Scott's friend, a typical trick used by villains. Sweating profusely, Scott dared not look at the full moon outside his window. He tried to cool down with cold water, but it was ineffective. His nails became sharp, fangs grew in his mouth, and his eyes turned yellow. Just then, Stiles came over. Despite Scott prioritizing his love life over their friendship, Stiles still cared about him. Scott, barricading his door, asked Stiles to take Allison home, but Stiles said someone had already taken her. Scott guessed that Derek, the werewolf who had bitten him, was responsible for the dismembered girl in the forest. Stiles was shocked after hearing that because Derek had just driven Allison away. Scott locked the door, no longer restraining his beastly nature, and embraced his new identity as the teen wolf, kicking off his heroic mode. He dashed towards the mountains, following the scent to discover Allison's hormone-smelling jacket. Meanwhile, Stiles drove to Allison's house and tried to explain everything to her mother, only to find Allison safely at home, brought back by Derek. In the forest, Derek swiftly tackled Scott to the ground. He had lured Scott there to explain everything, but sensing danger, he hastily warned him to flee, saying they were here. But Scott was a step slow, and a whooshing sound followed. An arrow pierced his arm. Through his blood-red vision, he saw 3 hunter-like men approaching. The leader ordered them to capture Scott alive, but his companions were thrown aside by Derek, who had returned. Taking advantage of the hunter's distraction, Derek rescued the teen wolf. Once safe, Scott reverted to human form, and Derek explained the dangers of the hunters, saying they had been hunting the werewolves for centuries. Scott was overwhelmed, blaming him for transforming him and dragging him into this trouble. Derek countered, saying, "This is a blessing most people only dream of." He insisted that Scott would like it once he learned to control its power, and Scott needed his help. The next morning, Stiles found Stiles on the highway, feeling sorry for his friend who still had to scheme for his own happiness. Scott almost came to blows with him over a hot girl back in the day. Stiles said if needed, he would chain Scott up during the full moon and feed him live mice. After school, a nervous Scott waited for Allison. Surprisingly, Allison was very understanding and didn't fuss about being stood up the night before, since her father came to pick her up. Scott tactfully made his exit, but on an impulse, turned back to look at her. The father he hadn't met yet was the hunter leader who had shot him the previous night. Allison turned out to be from a family of werewolf hunters, leaving Scott utterly disheveled. Afterwards, Scott confides in Stiles about Allison's father being a werewolf hunter and having previously shot him with a crossbow. Stiles hurriedly reassures Scott, saying that at least the father hadn't recognized him. The scene shifts to the lacrosse field training. Team Captain Jackson is targeting Scott, along with the coach's taunts, fueling Scott's anger. He's unable to suppress his inner wolf, but thankfully his helmet covers his transformation. Scott's loss of control results in Jackson's dislocated shoulder. While everyone rushes to check on Jackson, only Stiles notices his friend's condition. Scott is about to transform, and the anger is making him lose control. As they head to the locker room, they're unaware Derek is also there, stern and imposing. Previously, Derek had offered to teach Scott how to control his transformations, but Scott had refused. Inside the locker room, Scott transformed into a werewolf, completely losing his senses and attacking his best friend. Stiles narrowly escapes and uses a fire extinguisher to snap Scott out of it. Despite the risk of losing his life, he remains devoted to Scott. After this ordeal, they realize that anger is a catalyst for transformation. Unfortunately, lacrosse is a violent sport, and there's a game scheduled for Saturday. Stiles advises Scott not to play, but Scott feels obligated to participate for the team's honor. After school, Scott and Stiles video chat about the day's events. With Jackson's dislocation, it's even harder for Scott to drop out of the game. As Scott frets, Stiles leans in closer on the video, his expression changing. He tries to type a warning to Scott that there's someone behind him, but the message fails to send due to poor reception. Derek appears behind Scott, scolding him for nearly transforming on the field. If he's exposed, other werewolves could be at risk too. Derek warns Scott that if he plays on Saturday, he will destroy him and revoke his gift by force. The next day, Scott approaches the coach to request a withdrawal from the game. The goofy coach wonders if it's because of a girlfriend. Scott denies it. The coach persists, asking if it's because of a boyfriend, noting that the handsome goalie Danny is gay. Well, now we all know the goalie is gay, thanks to the coach's digression. Scott insists on withdrawing, citing recent aggressive tendencies. Surprisingly, the coach's eyes light up at this, claiming it's the key to victory and young people need to be fiery. Seeing Scott about to protest further, the coach issues an ultimatum: give up this game or be benched forever. Scott hesitated as he left the coach's office, surprised to see a text from his mom wanting to watch his game the next night. Looking up, he ran into Allison, who was eagerly anticipating his performance on the field. With so many people looking forward to the game, the pressure was on. After parting ways with Scott, Allison found her lost jacket in her locker. At the end of the hallway, a werewolf was lurking, spying on her sexy body. During class, the school beauty Lydia took the opportunity to whisper to Scott while they worked on a problem. She complained about Scott injuring her shitty boyfriend and now wanting to drop out of the game. Lydia, always vain, was with Jackson not just because he was from a wealthy family, but also because he was the champion team's captain. She wouldn't date a loser. Scott retorted that losing a game wouldn't kill anyone and might even save someone. Lydia threatened Scott, saying if he didn't play, she would introduce Allison to other handsome players. Now everyone was pressuring Scott to join the game. After school, Stiles rushed to find Scott. He wanted Scott to use his keen hearing to eavesdrop on a conversation between the police and the principal. They learned that due to a case involving a dead girl, the school would be under curfew. Both believed Derek was responsible for harming the girl, but they couldn't directly tell the police that Derek was a werewolf. At that moment, Scott noticed Lydia introducing Allison to other players. What irked him the most was that Allison seemed to think Lydia was nice. Scott felt angry but restrained himself, as he and Allison weren't officially in a hormone relationship yet. He noticed the stinky jacket Allison was holding, the one that Derek had hung in the woods the night of the party. Scott asked her seriously where the jacket had come from, which puzzled Allison. Scott grilled her about the night Derek walked her home. His concern was overwhelming, and his approach lacked subtlety. Unwilling to discuss it further, Allison left with a smile. Fuming, Scott blamed everything on Derek. He went to the ruins of Derek's old house, which had burned down 10 years ago, and shouted Derek's name. There, he smelled blood coming from a mound of earth. Derek appeared as elusive as ever and told Scott not to think he knew everything about werewolves just because his friend Googled it. He urged him to think about what could happen if he lost control and transformed in front of everyone at the game. Scott had no comeback, realizing how close he had come to harming Stiles the day before. It wouldn't be so lucky on the field. Derek picked up Scott's lacrosse stick, his fingers turning into claws, and tore the net. Partially transforming and then reverting with ease, he flexed the skill of an experienced senior. The teen wolf had a long way to go. In a blink, Derek was gone. Later, to investigate the source of the blood near Derek's house, they went to the town's hospital. Scott sneaked into the morgue to find the lower half of the discovered body, while Stiles covered for him. Unexpectedly, Lydia was also there, listening to Daniel CC Movie Channel and enjoying it much. Stiles gathered his courage to strike up a conversation, but it turned awkward as she kept listening to her favorite channel. In the morgue, Scott found the lower half of the girl's corpse. The scent of blood was exactly the same as the one near Derek's house. Jackson had his arm reattached and greeted Lydia with his juicy tongue, who encouraged him to take stimulants for the game. Stiles was completely shocked by their tongue wrestling and lost all interest in his studies. Late at night, after Derek left his house, the two friends, armed with shovels, headed to the ruins beside his house. Digging through a mound of earth, they unexpectedly uncovered a half-wolf corpse. Both were startled. The bloody scent was the same, but why was it coming from a half-wolf corpse? They decided to retreat, and while covering up the hole, Stiles noticed a plant called aconite, which is rumored to ward off werewolves. Pulling it out, they discovered a hemp rope wrapped several times around the grave. Unintentionally, they had broken a protective spell. Upon a closer look, Scott saw that the half-wolf corpse had transformed back into a woman, a werewolf capable of fully transforming into a wolf. The next day, the police arrested Derek. Scott felt a bit guilty under Derek's penetrating gaze, still unaware if he had done something good. Taking advantage of his sheriff dad's distraction, Stiles sneaked into the police car. He questioned Derek about why the dead girl could turn into a real wolf, whereas Scott couldn't. He suspected that Derek had killed the girl due to internal werewolf rivalries. Derek countered by telling him to look after his friend, questioning what he would do if Scott went on a rampage during the game, and whether he would continue to support him. Derek urged him to stop Scott from joining the game. The next second, Stiles' dad pulled him out, abruptly ending their conversation. On the way back, Scott felt his werewolf instincts stirring. He then noticed Stiles had left behind the aconite hemp rope, which had been affecting him. Stiles urgently pulled over and threw the rope far from his bag. Surprisingly, when he returned, Scott had disappeared. Stiles frantically searched the area and contacted his sheriff dad to inquire if there had been any strange reports, like someone wandering the streets like a dog. His dad, enough with his bullshit, hung up the phone. In the evening, a transformed Scott arrived at Allison's house and spied on her sexy body from the rooftop, his animal instincts raging. He completely disregarded Allison's hunter father. When Allison closed the curtains, Scott saw his fierce reflection in the mirror and was shocked back to reality. He leapt from the rooftop, coincidentally running into Allison's returning father. Fortunately, Scott had reverted to human form by then. Allison rushed over, hearing the commotion. In a moment of panic, Scott lied, saying he had decided to play in the game and had come to inform Allison. Now, he really had to participate in the game. Seeing his daughter so worried about this boy, her father reflected thoughtfully. He decided to watch the game too and kindly patted Scott on the back. Scott had really shot himself in the foot. Having a werewolf hunter watch him made the game devilishly difficult. Before the game, Stiles approached Scott, knowing full well he couldn't stop his friend, but still gently reminded him not to lose his temper. Initially, his words seemed comforting, but the more Scott heard, the worse he felt. Stiles warned him not to think about Allison, or the fact that her dad or Derek might want him dead, or that he himself might end up killing someone. The more Scott listened, the more he felt like he was about to explode. As the game started, Stiles was sweating bullets for his buddy, especially since his sheriff dad was also there. Meanwhile, Scott became an outsider on the field. The team captain Jackson purposely targeted him, ordering the players not to pass the ball to Scott. Jackson's goals fired up the crowd. Even Allison was cheering with a banner of his name. It was all too much for Scott. Stiles sensed trouble brewing but felt powerless, a perennial bench warmer. Scott's anger rose from deep within, his breaths heavy and goose growls escaping his throat, drawing wary glances from the referee and fear from the opposing players who instinctively kept their distance. Allison's father asked which number Scott was. Allison replied, "It's the only player who hasn't touched the ball today." She hoped he was okay. Then, Scott transformed into his werewolf form and single-handedly scored a stunning goal, earning cheers from everyone. The goofy coach even shouted for everyone to pass the ball to Scott. Intimidated by Scott's presence, an opposing player passed him the ball. Scott broke through the defense and scored powerfully, even tearing through the goalie's net, leveling the score by himself and becoming the star of the night. As the game neared its end, Scott got the ball again with all the opposing players closing in. With just 6 seconds left and using his keen werewolf senses, he scored from a long shot, clinching the game. The crowd went wild. Scott removed his gloves and saw his hands had turned into claws, so he quickly rushed to the locker room, leaving everyone puzzled. Allison followed him, and her werewolf father looked on sharply, sensing something amiss. Stiles didn't rush to check Scott because his father had received a distressing call from the police station, capturing his attention. In the dimly lit changing room, Allison followed but couldn't see Scott anywhere. A chill ran down her spine to her smelly butt as she felt something watching her. Scott swiftly moved overhead, and eventually Allison found him in a corner. He had reverted to human form in a short time, indicating he was beginning to control his transformations. Thinking his odd behavior was due to excitement, Allison calmed him down using her juicy tongue. Stiles arrived late, hurt by the scene unfolding before him, thinking that everyone's worried about him, but he was here flirting. After Allison left, a clueless Scott cheerfully approached Stiles, unaware of his friend's jealousy. Stiles then shared the latest news from the police, telling that Derek had been released because the police believed an animal was the murderer, and the dismembered girl was Derek's sister, Laura. The case had turned murkier. On the field, Jackson discovered the secret of the gloves. All fingers were torn through. He wondered what kind of stimulant Scott had taken, more convinced than ever that Scott was hiding something. At that moment, he noticed a man under the lights watching him. It was Derek, who had watched the entire game. If Scott lost control, he'd really intervene. After school in the evening, Scott and Allison sneak onto the school bus for a fishy date. Things heat up quickly, and Scott's heartbeat accelerates. His fingers turn into claws, tearing through the seat. His inner wolf stirs, and he immediately pulls back, knowing if he continued, he might tear Allison apart. Terrified, Allison tries to retreat, but Scott grabs her ankle and drags her sexy body back. Allison struggles hard, and then runs to the exit. In a rage, the teen wolf tears apart the seats and throws them, leaving Allison bruised and struggling to open the bus door. It turns out this was all a wet yet terrifying dream. Scott and Stiles discuss it with great interest. The dream was too real, so wet and terrifying. Scott is somewhat worried because he has a date with Allison the next night, and he fears the dream might come true. He even considers seeking advice from Derek, despite him having been arrested the day before. When they open the door and see the blood-stained school bus, they are shocked. Wondering if last night's dream was real, Scott immediately looks for Allison, his heart racing with fear, his beast instincts surging. Losing control, he punches a cabinet to smithereens, barely managing to calm down. To his shock, he runs into Allison around the corner, feeling a relief at having her back. But what an alarming coincidence this was. The only thing making him happy that morning was finding out the smashed locker belonged to Jackson. Scott leaves in a huff, later learning that the attacked bus driver was found severely injured and terrified. Reflecting on the vivid dream from the night before, Scott begins to doubt himself. During dinner, Scott made up his mind to seek out Derek because, unlike Derek, who remained calm and unchanged under the full moon, Scott found himself running wild at midnight, attacking innocents. In order to confidently go on a date with the girl of his dreams, he had to consult Derek beforehand. However, Scott's long-awaited date with Allison turns into a group date. Allison, Lydia, and their friends gathered around. Poor Stiles was left feeling unpopular, receiving none of the attention that Scott got. Jackson arrived last, aggressively taking others' seats and pushing others away. When asked why he didn't take Danny's seat, the girly Danny replied because he didn't spend his time staring at others' girlfriends. The girly Danny had just ignored Stiles' attempt to be friendly. Women were one thing, but Stiles was hurt even more by the indifference from a girly male classmate. Upon learning about Scott's date with Allison tomorrow night, Lydia suggested that she and Jackson join them. Scott was reluctant, but since Allison had agreed, he had no choice. Before the date even started, the two couples began competing, deciding to settle their rivalry with a bowling match, Jackson's forte. Scott was determined not to be outdone, boasting about his excellent bowling skills. After school, Stiles was indignant, wondering why even girly Danny looked down on him when his buzz cut was clearly handsome. Scott also complained, puzzled why a date for two had turned into a group date. Later, Stiles hurried to the pet hospital. Suddenly, Stiles' sheriff father showed up, causing Scott to worry he had been discovered. However, it turned out he was just there to treat a police dog. The conversation with the vet about wolf behavior linked to recent crimes gave Scott a flashback. He had done such things in his dreams, but something didn't add up. The driver had scratch marks, whereas wolves typically go for the throat. Scott knew the truth that the culprit was a werewolf. Since his mother was a nurse at the hospital, Scott used the pretext of delivering food to secretly visit the school bus driver. When the driver saw him, he became agitated, his eyes filled with terror, exclaiming that Scott wanted to silence him here. Fortunately, Scott's mother arrived just in time to defuse the situation. After this incident, Scott became even more convinced that he himself was the culprit. Meanwhile, deep in the woods by Derek's old house, a patrol officer was deterred from investigating by Derek's intimidating presence and a fiercely barking police dog, hinting at danger and causing him to step away from the old house. Later, Scott sought Derek's help to unearth memories and control his transformations against the full moon. Not for free, though. Derek outlined methods to trigger memories at the crime scene, offering further lessons for a fee. Derek had always been a guardian for the teen wolf and was ready to offer his help. That night, Scott sneaked into the crime scene, with Stiles keeping watch. Following Derek's advice, Scott's memories from that night flooded back. It wasn't a full moon, but he had transformed in his sleep. Approaching the school bus, the memories became overwhelming. He had been summoned to the school, entered the bus, and it was the bus driver who had suffered, not Allison. But Scott wasn't the attacker. He had tried to help the driver, but was wounded by another's claw. As the nearby lights came on, Stiles urged him to leave. Back safely, Scott revealed the attack's true nature. He had seen glowing eyes and been scratched. It wasn't him, it must have been Derek. Scott believed he was protecting the driver, but Stiles thought it was some sort of ritual. Whether saving someone or participating in a hunt, Scott didn't want to think about it anymore. Relieved he wasn't the assailant, he was free to date, much to Stiles' dismay, who felt forgotten in Scott's pursuit of romance. The four friends met up at the bowling alley. Allison's bowling skills were top-notch, and Jackson's stance was quite flashy. Scott was incredibly nervous because the tall tales he'd been spinning were about to be punctured. He bit the bullet and bowled, but both balls headed straight for the gutter, drawing relentless mockery from Jackson. Scott was mortified. Allison stepped up to boost his morale, urging him to focus on something joyful, like imagining her naked. This thought had Scott grinning crookedly, and suddenly he was on fire. His aim turned laser accurate, and he knocked all the pins down in one go. What a sly dog. Meanwhile, Derek was at the gas station when he was cornered by Allison's father, Chris, and a group of werewolf hunters. Despite their provocations, using his sister's death to enrage him, Derek remained composed. To his surprise, Chris signaled his mates to smash Derek's car window. The hunters left after giving Derek a stern warning to keep his actions in check. Back at the date, Scott scored strike after strike, leaving Jackson fuming. Scott tried to make peace privately, suggesting they drop their rivalry. But Jackson suspected foul play, convinced Scott must have cheated, and was determined to uncover his secrets. Derek sneaked into the hospital to speak with the injured bus driver. He wanted to learn what happened that night, but the driver just kept apologizing and calling out Derek's surname before he died. When Scott dropped Allison home later, he couldn't resist flirting her hormones out of her. Allison's father saw everything. After Scott returned home, Stiles came over with news he'd overheard from the police. The injured driver had died. Scott assumed Derek had killed him to silence him, so he rushed to Derek's old house to confront him. In the darkness, Derek stated his innocence. Scott brought up Derek's sister, which enraged Derek, who explained he had returned to find his sister used as bait and killed. Despite the confrontation, Derek maintained he hadn't killed the driver or his sister. The altercation between the two wolves ended with Scott's defeat. Derek reiterated he hadn't killed anyone, and it wasn't their fault. Scott, however, blamed Derek for ruining his life. Derek had to reveal that he hadn't turned Scott into a werewolf. As Scott nursed his wounds, he recalled the night of the attack. The werewolf who had summoned him and attacked the driver was different from Derek, more wolf-like and feral. Derek explained that this was an alpha werewolf, the dominant leader in their world, while he and Scott were beta werewolves, the seconds in command. Derek believed the alpha was responsible for his sister's death and had been hunting it, but needed Scott's help. He chose Scott because the alpha had bitten him, making Scott a direct recruit. Scott was summoned by the alpha, and the bus attack was a hunting lesson from him. Unbeknownst to them, as they discussed these revelations, a pair of blood-red eyes watched from the darkness of the forest outside the old house. The scene shifts to an elegant older lady drives into Beacon Hill's town, lost in her song, unaware that a monster with red eyes is stalking her. It's the alpha werewolf. Women have a strong sixth sense, so she senses danger. Almost crashing as she looks around, she is shaken to wet her pants, but before she can catch her breath, the alpha leaps onto her car roof to attack. However, he has met his match. The woman shoots through the roof of the car, then gracefully flips out of the vehicle. It's clear she's well trained, and her trunk is filled with guns and ammunition. The alpha is critically wounded. His howl wakes the sleeping Scott and also attracts Derek. Elsewhere, Hunter Chris receives a notification that it's his sister Kate, who has returned home to support her brother. Derek finally tracks the alpha, but during the pursuit, he is accidentally shot by Kate. When Chris arrives, he first instructs his sister to restrain herself, knowing well Kate's way of handling things. The hiding Scott overhears their conversation and learns that the bullet in Derek is no ordinary one. It's coated with aconite, a substance lethal to werewolves. If not treated, death is certain within 48 hours. Derek, seeing his wound won't heal, realizes the gravity of his situation, and unusually for him, his face shows panic. Kate's arrival delights Allison the most. The two women are like sisters, sharing everything. However, Aunt Kate is particularly protective of her package, strictly forbidding Allison from touching it. Desperate, Derek goes to the school seeking Scott's help to find an antidote. While asking Jackson for directions, Jackson tries to bargain, mistakenly thinking that the timid Scott has become brave by buying stimulants or steroids from Derek. Running out of patience, Derek wants to ask someone else for help. Unexpectedly, Jackson blocks his way. The injured Derek can't control his transformation and accidentally scratches Jackson on the back of his neck with his claws. Later, using his enhanced hearing, Derek locates Scott by eavesdropping on a conversation between Allison and Lydia, learning that Scott is supposed to study at Allison's house tonight. Lydia bluntly asks if that is really for study, reminding them to bring protection. After school, a weakened Derek collapses in the parking lot and is discovered by Scott and his friend. Realizing Derek cannot heal from the gunshot, Scott recalls the conversation he overheard the night before. In full view of everyone, they take Derek with them. Derek instructs Scott to steal a bullet from Allison's house, where the antidote is hidden. After handing Derek over to Stiles, Scott heads to Allison's house, where Allison is even more eager than Scott. As they get intimate, Scott nearly loses control and quickly hides his claws under the blanket. At that moment, Stiles sends a text urging him to find the bullet quickly, clearly not wanting to stay alone with Derek and get the blood in his car. Faced with Stiles' incessant chatter, Derek threatens to rip out his throat if he doesn't shut up his smelly mouth. On the other hand, Scott feigned ignorance while coaxing some information about her aunt out of Allison. It turned out Kate had also lived near the town before, which explained why Scott found her so familiar. Allison showed him many of her hobbies, but her real talent lay in archery. Even without an arrow, the sight of the bow pointed at him gave Scott a start. The psychological shadow from the arrow shot by her father lingered still. Suddenly, Scott noticed the garage was filled with firearms. Allison hurriedly explained that her father sold guns to law enforcement agencies. He wasn't some gun fanatic. As Scott searched for the bullet, he probed whether she planned to take over her father's business. She hadn't decided yet, joking if she looked cooler with a gun. The two found another spot to get cozy, only to be caught by Chris in a rather awkward moment. Chris asked Scott to help him move some items, clearly trying to get him out of the house. Just then, Scott received the text from Stiles. Caught up in his affection, he had neglected his actual task. So, Scott cheekily asked Allison if they could study a bit more. Her father was speechless, urging him to get on his bike and head home and asking Allison to come inside with him. Just then, Kate stepped in to ease the tension, joking that the two were just fooling around in the garage and nothing more heated had happened. Unexpectedly, Kate offered Scott the chance to stay for dinner. Under the unfriendly gaze of Allison's father, Scott nervously stepped inside. Dinner with Allison's family was like sitting on pins and needles. Her mother was a formidable woman, and Chris and Kate grilled him like a criminal. Fortunately, Allison mediated. Stiles sent another urgent text, and Scott used the excuse of needing the restroom to call them to wait at the pet hospital. He needed more time. After all, Allison's house was like an armory supermarket. Who knew which bullet was the right one? Just as Scott started his search, he was caught by Kate. He lied about not finding the bathroom, and she flirted with him a bit before pointing him to the guest room. Scott had little hope, but then discovered a ray of light. It was Kate's guest room. The mysterious package was hidden under the bed. He quickly opened it and sifted through numerous bullets until he found a wooden box. One bullet was missing. It must be the one that shot Derek. Scott pocketed a bullet and noticed the French label on the box. He immediately texted Stiles. Derek weakly explained that it was a rare plant used against werewolves, and that bullet was the antidote. Having secured the bullet, Scott suggested leaving, but Kate kept him on the topic, bringing up 2 recent beast attacks. Scott feigned confusion, suggesting perhaps a mountain lion was responsible. Chris then shared his own tale. He had kept many dogs, but its gentle nature completely changed due to one bite, making it turn into a true killer. It seems that he was analogizing werewolves with the mad dog. In his story, Scott was the mad dog he spoke of. Meanwhile, Stiles had taken Derek to the pet hospital. The 3 branch-like tattoos on his back were likely a symbol of the wolf pack. The venom from his wound was spreading to his heart, and Derek was preparing for the worst, amputating his entire arm. He mentioned it so casually that it sent shivers down Stiles' spine. The awkward dinner finally ended. As Allison said goodbye to Scott, she boldly kissed him right in front of her stern father, leaving him fuming. Just as Scott was about to leave, Kate stopped him. She closed the door and asked if he had taken anything from her bag. Her words were a clear signal to Scott that he had been exposed. Scott felt a chill in his heart, perhaps due to Kate's rudeness. Allison, embarrassed, could not bear it. Chris also approached, having learned from Kate that her bag had been tampered with. Allison tried to defend her boyfriend to end the awkward confrontation, but her aunt was adamant, insisting on checking Scott's pockets. Chris, with a sharp look in his eye, silently agreed. Panicking, Scott realized the bullet was still in his pocket. He should have hidden it elsewhere, even in his shoes or stinky underwear. Suddenly, Allison came clean, claiming that Scott had been wronged. He hadn't taken anything. She then held up a giant condom, saying it was her stealing her aunt's condom, catching everyone off guard. Kate didn't deny it, confirming that there were indeed condoms in her bag. Her father, now unsettled, thought his daughter shouldn't be so flirty. Back at the pet hospital, Derek asked Stiles to amputate his arm. Just imagining the scene almost made Stiles shit his pants, so he tried every excuse to avoid it. Derek threatened to twist his head off if he didn't amputate his arm. Stiles had no choice but to proceed. Just then, Scott arrived in time and handed the bullet to Derek, who immediately relaxed. Before he could explain how to use it, he fainted. The bullet accidentally rolled into the drain. Scott quickly went to retrieve it, barely missing it, and using his claws, he managed to extract the bullet, partially transformed. Stiles revived Derek with a punch. Derek bit open the bullet and applied the fragments to his wound. The intense pain was followed by blue smoke emanating from the wound, and the gruesome veins retracted, restoring his arm to normal. Stiles was thrilled. Derek had survived, and Scott didn't expect any gratitude, just that he would never appear in his world again, or he would tell the hunters everything. Derek asked if he ever thought they would help him. Scott thought the hunters were better than Derek, who then offered to show him something. Later, Derek took Scott to a sanatorium to visit his comatose uncle, Peter, the only survivor of a major fire 6 years ago. Scott was curious if he was also a werewolf. Derek sadly noted that his uncle used to be a werewolf, but now was barely even a normal person. Previously, a fire had trapped 11 people in Derek's home. Only Peter escaped. Derek and his sister Laura had avoided the tragedy by being at school. The arsonist was definitely a hunter, as only they knew the true identity of Derek's family. But Scott tried to defend Allison's family. Perhaps there was a reason for it. Derek, showing half of his uncle's face burned, challenged to explain this. The hunters claimed only to kill adult werewolves and only with solid evidence. But the fire had also killed ordinary humans in his family. Derek added that this is the good deed done by the hunters, and Allison might end up doing the same. The feud between werewolves and hunters was irreconcilable after the fire. Under the nurse's scolding, they had to end their visit. Taking advantage of Allison's absence, the hunter siblings discussed the attack that occurred the previous night. The attacker was an alpha wolf targeting Kate, but she managed to hit a different werewolf instead. They speculated that it was Derek. Kate wanted to go after Derek to find out the identity of the alpha wolf, but Chris reminded his sister that they had to follow the rules. Kate, somewhat disdainful, questioned the importance of rules and asserting that she always played by the rules herself. The scene shifts to the alpha werewolf targeting a video store owner. Coincidentally, Jackson and Lydia were there to rent a DVD. The couple argued because Lydia was too domineering. Jackson complained about not wanting to watch The Notebook again, yet he searched for it in the store moments later. During his search, Jackson found the store manager's body. As the lights flickered, he noticed a red-eyed creature staring at him from behind. Rows of shelves were knocked over, trapping Jackson underneath. He had always wanted to become a werewolf, and it seemed his wish was about to come true, courtesy of the alpha wolf. However, when the alpha clawed open his collar, it suddenly stopped. Jackson's neck had been previously scratched by Derek, possibly mixing wolf venom with aconite poison, which made the alpha retreat. Lydia, who was taking selfies, screamed in shock. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, so neither of them saw the dark figure clearly. Scott and Derek were the first to arrive, speculating on the alpha's motives, wondering if this was just routine hunting practice. But Derek disagreed, stating that werewolves are predators but not necessarily killers. Scott questioned why he would want to be a killer, and Derek assured him they would find out. The alpha's motive for killing remained a mystery. As they left the rooftop, they failed to notice a giant swirl pattern beneath their feet. They headed to Derek's old house, where Scott expressed his frustration, stating he had his own life and did not want to be Derek's lackey or the alpha's pet. Derek solemnly told him that during the next full moon, the alpha werewolf would call on him again. If he didn't join in the killing, he would be the next target. Scott was visibly deflated upon hearing this. He had a kind of connection with the alpha that he couldn't escape. To comfort him, Derek offered to teach him another set of paid lessons for free. He then broke Scott's hand bones to keep him in human form, saying that the pain would help him regain his senses. The next day was Allison's birthday, and her Aunt Kate gifted her a pendant engraved with a wolf, claiming it was her most precious possession. The design was linked to a family secret, encouraging Allison to explore it herself. It was clear that Kate intended to lead Allison down the werewolf hunter's path. At school, Allison received a little surprise prepared by Lydia, which was quite nice. Scott only then realized it was Allison's birthday and had no time to prepare a gift. On a whim, he persuaded Allison to skip class for the day. For Allison, this was an adventure she had never experienced. They skipped their first class, chemistry, taught by a very strict teacher. Scott, always failing chemistry, was a particular concern for the teacher. Besides Scott, Lydia also missed class. Regarding the previous night's murder, the police claimed it was the work of a mountain lion. Stiles tried to gather information from Girly Danny, but he was unaware. Stiles also asked Girly Danny if he thought he himself was charming like a girl, leaving Danny puzzled. The alpha's attack left Jackson haunted. During a shower, he was frightened by 2 red glints and ended up peeing himself. Right then, Derek appeared to make sure Jackson hadn't seen anything significant. Werewolves can use their extraordinary hearing to detect the heartbeat of someone lying. After confirming Jackson hadn't really seen the alpha, Derek left satisfied. Stiles, worried about Lydia's state after the attack, decided to skip class too. He visited Lydia at her home, where she was still in shock, mourning the creature she thought she saw. Knowing the truth about werewolves, Stiles misled her into believing it was a mountain lion instead. Meanwhile, Scott and Allison headed to Beacon Hills Forest. They were affectionate as they walked and agreed to turn off their phones. However, Allison wanted to send one last text to thank Lydia for her birthday celebration. After the message, they looked into each other's eyes, sparks flying. Seeing Lydia in a half-dream state, Stiles decided to leave, but then heard Lydia call out in her sleep, begging him not to go. He rushed back to her bedside, only to hear her murmuring Jackson's name in her sleep. Lydia mistook Stiles for Jackson, leaving him feeling utterly chilled. Torn between staying or going, Stiles received Allison's text, which distracted him long enough to uncover a video on Lydia's phone. The video taken during her attack accidentally captured the alpha werewolf. Unlike Scott and Derek, this werewolf looked just like a real wolf. Elsewhere, the huntress Kate and her team approached Derek's old house. Her men were hesitant. Rules forbid them from killing innocent werewolves, but Kate never played by the rules. Inside, Derek sensed the trio's presence and hid, waiting for the right moment. As they entered, mocking him, Kate recounted how she killed Derek's sister, enraging him. He swiftly knocked out her men but was taken down by her stun gun. Amazed by his physique, Kate almost regretted having to attack him. Stiles, now holding Lydia's phone with the crucial evidence, wanted to tell Scott, but found Scott's phone was off, which frustrated him. In a fit of anger, he deleted the video, declaring he was done worrying about it. Meanwhile, despite his bulletproof muscles, Derek couldn't get up due to the stun gun's high voltage. Kate, standing over him, revealed that the alpha, not they, had killed his sister Laura. Derek, knowing Kate's history of deceit, remained stoic, yet shaken by the revelation. It's then revealed when the hunter found Laura. She had already been killed and her body bore bite marks. Laura was an alpha werewolf in her lifetime, and according to werewolf law, when a beta werewolf kills an alpha, it gains the alpha's power and ascends to become the new alpha. Kate had cleverly provoked Derek to extract information about the alpha. However, since Derek was unaware, she let him go, knowing his thirst for revenge would lead them to the real alpha. Embarrassed and enraged, Derek fled, chased out of his own home by the hunters. Stiles' sheriff dad visited the vet clinic to consult with the vet about an incident. He brought along a blurry security camera photo that captured the outline of a beast breaking through a window and transitioning from crawling to running. Wondering if an animal had become supernatural, the sheriff doubted it was a lion, but couldn't think of any other explanation. He sought the vet's insight, but he dodged the question, suggesting the sheriff consult someone more knowledgeable. It wasn't until the evening that the two students who had skipped class remembered there was a parent-teacher conference that night. They rushed back to school where teachers were meeting individually with parents. From Jackson's parents, we learned that he was adopted. Although he had never met his biological parents, he held them in high regard and set very high standards for himself. This was why he was determined to uncover the secret behind Scott's newfound bravery. He couldn't stand anyone outperforming him. Lydia's performance at school was nothing short of stellar. Excellent grades, high IQ, and strong leadership skills. The quirky coach had been mispronouncing Stiles' name for quite some time, much to the sheriff's bemusement. Eventually, the coach got back on topic, praising Stiles for his intelligence, but lamented that it wasn't applied to his studies. For instance, in the midterm exam, Stiles had elaborately described the history of circumcision. The sheriff thought it's a topic rich in history, but the coach said the test was actually on economics. Scott's phone was unreachable, which frustrated his mom. During roll call, the chemistry teacher expressed concern that Scott was lacking paternal affection. Chris and his wife learned from a teacher that their daughter Allison had skipped school for the entire day. They knew she must have been led astray by that boy. After the conference ended, Scott and Allison just barely made it back to school. Before the parents could confront them, chicken screams erupted in the parking lot, causing students and parents to flee in panic. Using his infrared senses, Scott detected a fleeting beast. The commotion was quickly quelled by 2 gunshots. At a critical moment, it's always the hunters who come through. Led by Chris, people gathered around to see that the cause of the disturbance was a lion. Case closed. To the ordinary townsfolk, the recent gruesome dismemberment cases, the school bus incident, and now the video store case seemed to be the work of this dangerous animal. However, those in the know understood that this was merely a smokescreen, a scapegoat for the werewolves. It was a way to calm the public and obscure the truth. Scott, fearing he might lose control on the next full moon, agreed to undergo special training from Derek. The scene shifts to Scott being attacked in the parking lot, terrified by the infamous Alpha. He had no courage to confront it and wanted only to escape. To mask the sound of his heartbeat, he set off car alarms along the way, but his location was betrayed by a call from Allison. Little did he know, this was part of Derek's special training. Disappointed in Scott, Derek lamented that despite the looming threat of the Alpha, Scott was still distracted by romantic interests. Derek declared werewolves didn't need women smashing Scott's phone. Scott was shaken. Women indeed distracted him, so they struck a deal. If Derek trained him properly, Scott would steer clear of women. No sooner had he agreed than they were back at it, their intimacy interrupted by the arrival of Kate. Scott quickly hid his hormone smell in a wardrobe. Kate had always wanted to lead Allison down the path of a hunter. She guided Allison in exploring legends of monsters, hoping Allison would take up the investigation herself. Meanwhile, Scott stealthily climbed over the wall, his keen senses picking up a wolf's low growl. Thinking it was Derek employing the same old tricks, a guilty Scott began explaining to the darkness, but this time it was real, the alpha werewolf. Frightened, his first instinct was to flee, not even considering transforming to fight back. Back home, Derek was already waiting in his room. Scott recounted his encounter, sensing the alpha's rage. Derek's expression changed slightly when he heard about the whirlwind pattern drawn on the car window, hinting at some clues he was unwilling to reveal. Under her aunt's guidance, Allison unearthed the secret history of a monstrous beast in 18th century France, which is said to have killed over 100 people until King Louis XV dispatched his finest hunter to kill it. Lydia, unimpressed, commented that's not a big deal even if her ancestor killed a giant wolf. Allison revealed more than just one wolf in the photos from the book, stirring fear in Lydia, who stubbornly remarked it just looked like a slightly bigger wolf to her. Scott and Stiles were also in the restaurant, but Scott deliberately avoided Allison. Stiles felt slighted, complaining that his friend had become too close to Derek and saying that he was way better than Derek. During lunch break, Scott and Stiles hit the basketball court for some practice. Stiles had figured out that controlling one's transformation was all about managing the heart rate. Whether Scott was angry or getting too cozy, a spike in his heart rate could trigger his werewolf instincts. So, Stiles tied Scott's hands and feet and started throwing balls at him to provoke anger while monitoring his heart rate with a wristband. Scott had no choice but to take the hits and keep his cool. Jackson happened to pass by and couldn't help but laugh at their foolishness. While mumbling to himself not to get angry, Scott's heart rate was skyrocketing. When it breached 160, Scott struggled to suppress his inner beast. Jackson's expression turned serious, suspecting there was more to this spectacle than met the eye. He tensely awaited Scott's transformation, unaware of his own troubling symptoms. His complexion had turned sickly, and his eyes were sunken. Scott held on, managing not to transform. This ordeal led him to a new understanding. It was a more complex emotion than anger. By mastering this state, he could control his transformations at will. Scott had an epiphany. No wonder Derek was a lifelong bachelor. Perhaps werewolves didn't need women who just slowed them down. Scott realized he needed to stay away from Allison, as her sexy body made him weaker. Jackson followed the duo to the locker room, eavesdropping on their conversation. He learned that Scott had to stay away from Allison for some reason, which Jackson saw as his chance to figure out what made Scott so brave. After discussing serious matters, Scott complained about the locker room's foul smell. Stiles was puzzled. He couldn't smell anything off. It turned out that Scott was sensing decay and death emanating from Jackson, which ordinary people couldn't detect. Jackson felt incredibly hot, and the scratch on his neck started oozing pus as if something was trying to burst out. Suddenly, a wolf's claw emerged from his mouth as if he was pregnant with a wolf baby. Actually, Jackson was undergoing a failed transformation after his infection, heading down a path of grotesque evolution. Taking advantage of the situation, Jackson approached Allison, sincerely apologizing for his past arrogance and bullying. He flirted subtly with Allison, carefully gauging her reactions. Jackson expressed his fondness for both Allison and Scott, hoping they would like him too. In class, the coach made fun of Scott, trampling all over his self-esteem. Stiles was monitoring Scott's heart rate and noticed it was nearing the danger zone. Suddenly, the heart rate dropped. Stiles looked up in surprise to see Allison secretly holding Scott's hand, calming his rage. Scott then realized that Allison wouldn't weaken him, but could actually give him strength. To test this theory, Stiles came up with another mischievous plan. They went to the parking lot where Stiles told Scott to stand in front of a car, holding the keys and not to move. He deliberately scratched the car and then loudly drew the attention of the car owner, who thought Scott was responsible. Scott ended up being roughed up by a group of tough guys, causing his heart rate to spike. But when he remembered Allison's smile, his heart rate stabilized. Finally, the chemistry teacher intervened and put an end to the chaos. Derek was driven from his home by hunters and unable to find the Alpha's trail. Disheartened, he visited his comatose uncle in the sanatorium again. Scott was too caught up in romantic entanglements, so he desperately needed his uncle's help. Despite Peter being in a vegetative state for 6 years, he made a good listener. Derek shared his suspicions that the Alpha might be a family member and speculated that besides his uncle, someone else might have survived the fire from 6 years ago. Peter's expression remained blank, unresponsive. As Derek became desperate for Peter to wake up, a nurse rushed over, scolding Derek for his aggressive behavior, and then reassured him that his uncle would respond to him if given long time. Derek replied he didn't have much time before leaving the room. Just then, Peter's finger twitched slightly. Uncle Peter might be waking up. After leaving the sanatorium, Derek found a message stuffed into his car. He looked around but found no trace of anyone. He had no choice but to follow this lead, whether it was a friendly gesture or a trap. That evening, Derek arrived at the pet hospital and confronted the vet, demanding to know when the vet found a deer carcass with a spiral pattern on it 3 months ago, why he persuaded the police to suppress this matter. The vet knew very well the significance of the symbol to werewolves and explained that it was merely a deer, a mere prank. But Derek pressed him further. He could hear the vet's heartbeat quicken. In a swift move, Derek subdued the vet, preparing to torture him for answers when Scott suddenly appeared and wanted to stop him. Derek knocked the vet unconscious with a punch, since the werewolves can control their wounds to prevent them from healing when conscious. Only then did Scott grasp the meaning of the spiral, a symbol of vengeance. If the Alpha's goals were not met, the killings would not cease. Derek was about to use his claws to verify the vet's identity when Scott intervened, stunning Derek. In just a few days, Scott had learned to transform at will and dared Derek not to touch the vet again. Scott had devised a way to confirm the identity without harming the vet. The two took the unconscious vet to the school, and Stiles was called over. As mentioned before, there's a connection between Scott and the Alpha. Scott's plan was to use the school's PA system to howl. If the vet was the Alpha, he would transform in public. If it was someone else, they would be summoned. Scott cleared his throat and howled. It was less of a wolf's howl and more of a mournful cry of a husky. Derek was speechless, and Stiles awkwardly scratched his head. He encouraged his friend to man up and be a real werewolf, not a wolf baby. Scott howled again, this time a deep and rugged howl that made the school tremble. Derek's expression changed suddenly. He was worried that the howl might not only attract the Alpha, but also alert werewolf hunters. Only then did the three realize that the tightly bound vet had disappeared. As they pondered, the Alpha attacked, giving Derek a fatal blow. It was as strong as a chimpanzee, sending Derek to meet his demise. Frightened, the two rushed into the school. They had stirred up more than they could handle, easy to invoke, hard to dismiss. Scott and another student quickly took refuge inside the school while the Alpha prowled outside. Stiles, in a desperate attempt to secure the school doors, ventured outside to fetch pliers. Ironically, Scott merely hid behind the door, seemingly unashamed. The barricades proved futile against the werewolf. Stiles suspected that the vet was the Alpha, deeply hidden among them, while Scott firmly believed otherwise. The two planned a daring escape by car when suddenly a Jeep's battery was hurled in, indicating that the Alpha not only knew their location, but had also cut off their escape route. They avoided staying near windows and hid in the locker room. Sensing footsteps outside, they ducked into a wardrobe, peering through the crack towards the door. The door handle turned, revealing the security guard, drawn by the broadcasted howl. Before they could explain, the Alpha attacked and sent the guard to guard the heaven. Meanwhile, Jackson, Lydia, and Allison received a text from Scott urging them to come to the school late at night, unaware of his actual intentions. As they arrived, the duo inside was engaged in a tactical battle with the Alpha, who Stiles managed to trap in a storage room. Taunting the creature behind an iron grill, they were shocked when the Alpha escaped through the roof. As Allison and the others searched for the duo, Jackson saw a figure at the end of the hallway that suddenly crawled away. Scott detected Allison's group and contacted them using Stiles' phone, eventually gathering at the swimming pool. Scott was frustrated, questioning why they came at such an hour, potentially complicating the situation. Confused, Allison asked if it wasn't Scott who called them there. Scott then realized that someone was orchestrating these events. Suddenly, footsteps on the roof signaled the Alpha's approach, forcing Allison and her friends to flee. They managed to elude the beast and hid in the cafeteria as the school fell into silence again. Allison demanded an explanation from Scott about who was pursuing them. Scott, reluctant to reveal the secret of the werewolves, impulsively blamed Derek. Allison questioned this, recalling the supposed lion killings, but Scott maintained it was Derek's doing and urged that they must flee or face a similar fate. Poor Derek, dead yet blamed for recent murders, became the scapegoat for the town's unsolved crimes. Despite the men's pleas, the trio insisted on calling the police, only to have their call abruptly disconnected when they mentioned the school's location. It turned out the police had received numerous prank calls about the Alpha at the high school that day. Scott recalled Derek's warning that the Alpha sought revenge, possibly targeting Allison as a descendant of hunters. Reluctantly, Stiles attempted to call his sheriff father, but to no avail. As the Alpha began battering the iron gate, the group fled to the chemistry lab, reminiscent of an escape room scenario. The lab had a back door leading to a safety exit, but the key was with the slain security guard. Scott decided to retrieve the key alone, but Lydia, showcasing her academic prowess, guided the group in making incendiary devices. However, during the process, Jackson maliciously swapped a critical ingredient, endangering Scott. Allison pleaded with Scott not to go, accusing him of lying throughout the night. Despite her protests, Scott left, determined to save everyone. Armed with the makeshift weapon, Scott followed a bloody trail to the basketball court, where he found the guard's body, realizing it was a trap set by the Alpha. The group was being manipulated, and as Scott risked his life for the key, Jackson took the opportunity to act concerned for Allison in front of his girlfriend. On the other side, Scott faced off against the Alpha. The incendiary device failed to ignite, something that was expected. This action infuriated the Alpha, which pinned Scott to the ground and let out a goose roar that shook the room. At the same time, the others heard the noise. Jackson's wound on the back of his neck began to burn, and Scott couldn't suppress his wolf instincts. He was indeed a descendant of the Alpha and had been forced to transform under the Alpha's command. A fleeting red glint in his eyes made Scott extremely bloodthirsty. Following the sounds of the four people, Scott approached the chemistry classroom. He was about to insert the key when he stopped, hearing Allison's voice. He struggled against the Alpha's command, waking up to the memories with Allison. The four inside the classroom didn't realize that they had narrowly escaped death. Soon after, the sheriff arrived with backup. Scott reverted to human form and declared the Alpha's plan a failure. The Alpha retreated silently. In fact, the night's events were a rite of passage designed by the Alpha for Scott to join his pack. Derek had mentioned that the Alpha wanted Scott to join him, and the price was to sever ties with his human connections, including friends and family. Stiles saw through it and felt the Alpha didn't really want to kill them. Scott confirmed, saying the Alpha intended for him to be the one to kill them. Derek and the security guards' bodies disappeared, and the police listed Derek as a suspect. The vet reappeared mysteriously. It was suspicious since he vanished right before the Alpha first appeared and re-emerged as soon as the Alpha vanished. After a night of harrowing adventures, Allison was deeply hurt by Scott. She refused to hear any explanations from a man full of lies. Heartbroken, Scott went drinking in the wilderness with Stiles. Scott wasn't drunk, but Stiles got drunk first. It's not his fault, though. After all, Scott had once been close with Lydia, Stiles' crush, who was now in someone else's bed. Meanwhile, two thugs tried to cause trouble but were scared off by Scott's presence. Scott quickly left with Stiles, sensing the Alpha's scent. Unbeknownst to them, the two thugs met a grim fate. One was killed on the spot, and the other was dragged to a bonfire and roasted into a turkey. Although the Alpha's scheme was thwarted, it planted a seed of brutality in Scott's heart. During a chemistry exam, Scott became restless and his vision blurred. The questions suddenly turned deadly serious, asking him to choose how to kill people on the night of the full moon. In a panic, Scott fled the classroom, and Stiles followed him out. Rejected, Scott lost his emotional support and couldn't control his emotions, especially on the night of the full moon. Stiles promised to chain him up for the night. At lunch, Allison and Jackson sat together, discussing Scott's odd behavior, unaware that Scott was listening from the hallway. Jackson kept egging Allison on, and when she questioned whether breaking up was a mistake, Jackson thought Scott deserved it. Enraged, Scott smashed his head against the wall. After school, the practice match began. Surprisingly, Stiles made the starting lineup. This news thrilled him immensely. At the same time, the coach announced a dual captain system. Scott was promoted to captain, much to Jackson's displeasure. But this was just the beginning of a series of retaliations. Under the influence of the Alpha and a recent heartbreak, Scott turned dark. Before the game, he approached Lydia, and Stiles naively thought his friend was just feeling out the situation for him. He asked Scott if Lydia had hinted at any hormone feelings for him. Knowing full well that Stiles had a crush on Lydia, Scott still flirted with her, deciding to pay Jackson back in his own coin because he flirted with Allison. Lydia, also seeking revenge on Jackson, willingly reciprocated Scott's advances. The two were like a match to Tinder. On the field, Scott was aggressively confrontational, knocking over Jackson's pals. Stiles noticed Lydia's smeared lipstick. The only one she had seen before the game was Scott. Stiles was dumbfounded by their smelly kiss. His world collapsed. Anyone could flirt with Lydia, but not his best friend. Meanwhile, Kate was secretly training Allison, teaching her that women need to be strong and that men are unreliable in dangerous situations. Allison recalled Scott's behavior that night, proving her aunt's point. Consequently, Kate learned that Scott and Stiles had been in contact with Derek. Her expression turned grave, and she pressed Allison for everything she knew about Derek. In the evening, Stiles's visit surprised Scott's mother, especially since he had his own key to their house. Once his mom left, Stiles threw a heavy gift in front of Scott, who insisted he was fine and didn't need worrying over. Stiles was just trying to find a way out, hoping it was the full moon that caused Scott's murderous look. Scott dismissively told him to leave. The darkened Scott was something else, even disowning his best friend. Stiles hoped to show Scott something good before he left. Scott pulled out a chain from his bag and scornfully asked if Stiles really thought he needed to be chained up like a dog. Just as Scott let his guard down, Stiles handcuffed him to the radiator. Locked to the radiator, Scott glared at Stiles with hatred. Stiles said he was both protecting and getting back at him, knowing about his intimate moment with Lydia. Even the angelic Stiles had his limits. The two best friends were hurting each other. Stiles used a dog bowl to humiliate Scott, who in turn detailed his passionate kiss with Lydia, determined to break Stiles's heart. Unable to bear it, Stiles walked out of the room. Meanwhile, Allison and Jackson ran into each other at the supermarket and hit it off. Allison got into his car to share her troubles. Something felt off. Allison believed that the thug that night wasn't Derek, and her life was filled with lies, not just from Scott, but from her father as well. On the other side, Scott's wrists became bloody in his efforts to make Stiles unlock the handcuffs. He tried everything from blaming the full moon to invoking their breakup to evoke Stiles's sympathy, acting like a true movie star. Stiles was also suffering, listening to his friend's screams and pleas. Then suddenly, all was quiet in the bedroom. Scott had broken the handcuffs and escaped. In the supermarket parking lot, Jackson also opened up about his experiences. Unbeknownst to the talking pair, a furious, transformed Scott was ready to attack, driven by their apparent intimacy. But just as he was about to leap onto the car roof, a figure intervened and whisked him away. It was Derek, proving he wasn't out of the game yet. Derek managed to snap Scott out of his frenzy. While searching for Scott, Stiles stumbled upon a police crime scene, which made him panic as he frantically looked for his sheriff father. Ordinary people are unaware of the dangers of a full moon night. Not far off, the Hunter siblings arrived, and from their conversation, it was clear that Chris was still unaware of Scott's identity, though he was certain Scott was a high school student. Meanwhile, Derek had taken Scott back home. Fed up with everything werewolf-related, Scott listened as Derek shared a legend. Killing the alpha werewolf would cure those it had bitten. This intrigued Scott. At the same time, the alpha climbed to the summit of Beacon Hills, overlooking the brightly lit town. After a false alarm, Jackson discovered a claw mark embedded in a car door, which got him thinking. He hurried home, fetched Scott's gloves for comparison, and found that the holes matched the claw marks. He was getting closer to the truth. In the evening, as the chemistry teacher was preparing to leave work, he discovered a list on his desk. The names marked with red crosses had all been murdered, with his own name as the last entry. Panicking, he stuffed the list into his pocket, but a menacing growl echoed behind him. The alpha finally spoke, asking if he knew who wrote this list. The teacher first begged for mercy before revealing the name Laura, Derek's sister, and the former alpha werewolf. Enraged, the alpha ordered him to turn around and see what he had done. Terrified, the teacher couldn't bring himself to turn, only continuing to plead. As the alpha approached, Derek burst in and saved the chemistry teacher, while the alpha fled before Derek could pursue him. Due to Scott's lies, the police arrived, and Derek ended up taking the blame for the alpha, now having to avoid the police and hunters alike. Derek hid in a steel mill, but when the police released their dogs, the influence of the werewolf blood caused the dogs to whimper and return to their handlers. It turned out that Stiles had stolen his sheriff father's communicator and learned about Derek's predicament in the steel mill, so he and Scott set off to rescue him. Despite Chris's gunfire, they managed to extract Derek, who was furious. He had just located the Alpha when the damn police showed up. Stiles was unhappy, reminding Derek that his sheriff dad was just doing his job. After some heated exchanges, Derek shared some crucial information. His sister Laura had mentioned investigating a fire from 6 years ago and had uncovered 2 key clues. One is a pattern recognized by Scott, identical to Allison's pendant, and the other is their chemistry teacher. This was why Derek had been keeping a close eye on the teacher, preventing the Alpha from getting to him first. Derek shared his suspicion that the Alpha was also investigating the fire from 6 years ago, believing it to be a member of his own family. It seems that someone else besides Peter had also survived the fire. Derek asked the two to get Allison's pendant, but Scott had just been dumped. Ashamed, he felt he couldn't possibly ask to borrow the pendant. Stiles encouraged him to get the pendant, kill the Alpha, and win Allison back. On the other side, Jackson visited the hospital feeling worse day by day since Derek had scratched him, plagued by nightmares of a fire, the screams hauntingly real. During a checkup, the doctor found something under his skin and removed a blood-stained rope and petals of monkshood. Jackson woke screaming, the nightmare fueled by the monkshood toxin in his body, which causes hallucinations. Realizing this, Jackson smugly approached Scott, threatening to reveal his secret to Allison unless he helped him gain similar powers. Scott was troubled, worried that word would eventually reach Allison's father. Stiles tried to calm him, advising him to first secure the pendant. Meanwhile, Scott attempted to reminisce about old times with Allison, but it only pushed her further away. At lunch, Jackson taunted Scott, threatening to manipulate Allison if he didn't cooperate. Unwilling to stoop to such lows, Scott decided to steal the pendant instead. As Jackson invited Allison to watch the semifinals that evening, claiming it was Scott's idea, Scott, rummaging through Allison's bag nearby, overheard and was confused by Jackson's motives. Allison's bag didn't contain the pendant. Scott felt as uncomfortable as if he were constipated. Lydia, furious, confronted Jackson because she had received a text from him demanding she hand over the spare keys to her house, clearly a signal that their relationship was over. Jackson, feeling overly confident, smugly declared it was time to shed some dead weight, referring to Lydia as his biggest burden. He hadn't even turned into a werewolf yet, but his ego was already inflated. Their breaking up probably would make Stiles jump for joy. After school, Stiles returned home only to find Derek hiding in his room. The sheriff came looking for Stiles, but he managed to keep him outside. The dad told him he was eagerly anticipating Stiles' debut performance. After dealing with his dad, Stiles returned to his room where Derek cornered him against the wall, threatening him. Stiles retorted Derek, asking him to follow his rules here since he's covering him. Meanwhile, there was no news from Scott, and the chemistry teacher was now under police protection. Stiles decided to try a different approach. On the night the Alpha invaded the school, Allison and 2 others received texts from Scott, but they weren't sent by him. Stiles suspected the Alpha was involved and knew just a computer whiz to track the origin of the messages. It's the girly Danny. Stiles lied, saying Derek was his cousin. Danny was a bit wary, commenting that his cousin seemed pretty intense and why there is blood on his shirt. Stiles quickly claimed it was just a nosebleed and urged Derek to change his shirt, which he reluctantly did, mentally noting this grievance. Initially, girly Danny was hesitant to help, but he was visibly enchanted by Derek's physique, unable to take his peeping eyes off him. Realizing the opportunity, Stiles blurted out asking Danny what he thought about Derek. A shy Danny couldn't look at Derek's hormone-radiant muscles and immediately got to work tracking the message. On the other side, Scott sneaked into Allison's house and found the pendant inside an ancient French tome. He noticed Allison's annotations and realized she was investigating werewolves. A worried Scott pondered the implications if Allison were to follow in her family's footsteps and become a werewolf hunter. With the pendant in hand, Scott was about to climb over the wall to leave when he was caught by Allison's father. Meanwhile, Danny proved to be efficient, quickly tracing the IP address of the message. It had come from the hospital, and the account belonged to Scott's mother. Stiles was absolutely stunned by this revelation. Chris thought Scott had come looking for his daughter and invited him for a drink while Allison was out, suggesting they have a private chat, man to man. Scott, however, only wanted to leave and ended up confessing that Allison had broken up with him. Chris expressed regret, but he was likely secretly thrilled. Soon after, Chris became serious and asked how Scott knew Derek. Scott panicked and then put on a rebellious front, saying he didn't know Derek was a serial killer. Chris then backed off, dispelling his suspicions about Scott. Their conversation turned back to Allison, causing Scott much inner turmoil as everything he had done was to protect Allison, yet she hadn't given him a chance to explain. Allison, having just returned from a run, overheard Scott's heartfelt words and realized she had wrongly blamed him. Later at the semifinals, Scott noticed Stiles wasn't around as the two had kept the truth about the texts from him involving his mother. Stiles gave up his debut, and Derek reconsidered his view of him, suddenly finding him more favorable. However, the thought of seduction still bothered him, and he ended up punching Stiles in the head. Since Derek was a wanted criminal and couldn't show his face, he sent Stiles to investigate Scott's mother. Before the game, Jackson approached Scott to ask how he was doing and if he also wanted to use his supernatural abilities on the field. Scott explained that only an alpha werewolf could recruit followers, while a beta werewolf's bite was useless. Jackson urged Scott to summon an alpha, but Scott admitted he didn't even know where to find one. He explained a lot, including about the hunters who pursue werewolves. Following Scott's gaze, Jackson noticed Allison's family and realized her surname, which means silver in French, a substance legendary for its use against werewolves, but here it represented a family name, one known for hunting werewolves. Meanwhile, Stiles couldn't find Scott's mother and was directed by Derek to ask the nurse who had been caring for the comatose Uncle Peter. Arriving at the hospital room, Stiles found both the nurse and Peter absent. Derek, shocked by the news, soon realized the gravity of the situation and told Stiles to leave quickly. Peter was the alpha. Stiles was in disbelief when Peter, standing behind the door, greeted him warmly. The alpha werewolf turned out to be the comatose Peter, surprisingly handsome despite his condition. Stiles tried to flee for his shitty life, but was stopped by the nurse who was in league with Peter. Stiles was desperate when Derek appeared the next second and knocked the nurse unconscious. Amidst the confrontation, Stiles chose to stay out of it. Peter tried to explain, but Derek transformed into a werewolf, but after a brief struggle he was knocked down easily, proving Derek's inadequacy. Uncle Peter lifted his nephew with one hand and explained why he had mistakenly killed Laura. It turns out the fire had damaged his body and wiped out his thoughts. For 6 long years, his cells repaired themselves one by one, and it was only a few months ago that he truly woke up. He had taken Laura's alpha place, but that was driven purely by instinct. Derek remained unmoved, focused only on avenging his sister. But Uncle Peter didn't even need to transform to overpower him, beating the shit out of him until he was down. On another note, the chemistry teacher confessed to the police about an incident 6 years ago when a woman drunk at a bar showed a keen interest in chemistry and approached him. They exchanged knowledge about chemistry rather than kisses, and she asked fatally incisive questions about how to make arson look like spontaneous combustion. Drunk, he revealed everything. Days later, Derek's family's house was on fire, and the woman disappeared without traces of her smelly hormones. He only remembered her pendant, which was identical to the one Allison wore. It's a gift from Kate, suggesting Kate was the arsonist of that fire. However, the chemistry teacher's frequent eye movements while speaking indicated he might also be hiding something else. Back to Derek, he crawled on the ground as Uncle Peter assessed his disappointing nephew. Peter had hoped to find an alpha successor after taking revenge on the arsonist, considering either his nephew Derek or Scott. However, he hadn't anticipated the strength the power of the alpha would bring him, so he changed his mind. Looking at his reflection, even with half his face burned, he couldn't deny his handsome appearance and decided to be the alpha forever. As the semifinals approached, Jackson gave a final ultimatum to Scott: turn him into a werewolf within 3 days, or he would seduce Allison onto his smelly bed. The overjoyed sheriff rushed to the stadium but found no sign of his son's debut. Allison introduced Jackson to her Aunt Kate, who noticed scars on the back of Jackson's neck, and asked Chris if a beta werewolf scratch could turn someone into a gamma werewolf. Chris replied that it was possible if the scratch was deep enough. Scott overheard their conversation and realized Jackson had inadvertently become his shield. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or worried for Jackson. Scott easily leads his team to the finals using his werewolf abilities. Meanwhile, the relationship between Allison and Scott heats up. Unexpectedly, Jackson's pal intentionally sabotages them, leading to Allison being taken away by her father. Jackson approaches menacingly, proposing a mutual benefit that Scott gives him the power of the werewolf and he'll help Scott win back his girl. In the locker room, after everyone else leaves, Uncle Peter and Derek confront Scott, who quickly realizes that the now healed Peter is the alpha. Clearly, the uncle and nephew have teamed up to seek revenge on the arsonist responsible for a fire years ago. Scott looks angrily at Derek. The Alpha had killed Derek's sister, but Derek claims it was an accident and has forgiven his uncle. Scott refuses to join them, and Peter stabs him in the neck with his claw, triggering a flood of memories about the fire 6 years ago. This is a unique werewolf ability, to transfer memories to another werewolf. It shows that Peter's victims were all involved in the arson. Despite his escape, he was severely burned and spent 6 years healing before waking up. Driven by instinct, he seized the Alpha's power from Laura. On the other side, Allison starts having vivid wet dreams. She wakes up to find that the pendant her aunt gave her is missing, so she searches for it in the garage. Unexpectedly, she overhears her father and aunt discussing family secrets. Kate urges Chris to reveal the truth to Allison, but he refuses. Kate, noticing Allison in the car, doesn't expose her, but instead leaves behind a bullet. As previously mentioned, now the hunters mistook Jackson for a werewolf, so Chris approached him, using a neck wound as a pretext to test his identity. Jackson panics, realizing he's been targeted before even becoming a werewolf. Fearing a fatal mistake, Scott rushed to save Jackson. Unable to stand by and see Jackson harmed because of him, Scott still must ensure his safety, despite being threatened by Jackson. The more Scott thinks about it, the angrier he gets, and the two end up wrestling their tongues fiercely. Stiles advises them not to take their anger out on his car. Scott warns Jackson that the power of the werewolf will only ruin his life. Jackson, envious yet contemptuous of Scott, retorts that he would enjoy the power of a werewolf and he would be destined to soar like a goose. Meanwhile, Allison and Lydia test the bullet left by Kate in the forest, discovering it can spark and is primarily used to blind werewolves. As the girls prepare to leave, a suddenly appearing Scott is knocked down by Allison with a stun gun. In her panic, Scott quickly returns the pendant to her. In the evening, Stiles sees his dad sorting through cases and tries to glean some information. However, cautious of his son's intentions, the sheriff remains guarded. Stiles then resorts to plying his father with alcohol. Slightly tipsy, the sheriff reveals that the recently murdered school bus driver and record store owner both had a history of arson. To extract more information, Stiles continues to ply his father with drinks. On the other side, Allison decided to visit Scott's house as a way to mend their misunderstanding. Scott's mother had plans that evening, conveniently leaving the two of them alone. Scott was puzzled by how stunning his mother looked, feeling the need to keep a peeping eye on her date mate. Just then, the doorbell rang. Scott's mother, still getting ready, asked her son to answer the door. Although Scott was happy for his mother, he froze as he was about to open the door. The person outside was daunting. Scott instinctively stepped back as the door swung open. It was Peter, who's aiming to be Scott's stepdad. While Peter claimed he just wanted to take Scott's mother out for dinner, Scott was skeptical. It seemed clear he was using Scott's mother to coerce Scott to join his side. Without his wolf pack, an alpha still couldn't be considered a king. Watching as his mother was taken to breed wolf babies, Scott could only grit his teeth and bid them goodbye. Meanwhile, Derek approached Jackson, promising to show him the way to join the werewolf team. Jackson was tempted, and when the two left, they didn't notice Kate watching them from the shadows, convinced more than ever that Jackson was the beta wolf turned by the alpha. Concerned for his mother, Scott asked Allison to stay and wait as he rushed out the door. Peter intended to turn Scott's mother into a werewolf too. Then he'd have his wife, wolf baby, and nephew all in one place. But just as he was about to bite, his car was unexpectedly rear-ended. Scott had called for backup. With Stiles' intervention, Peter's date was ruined. From a distance, Peter yelled at Scott that some people's cleverness irks him, taking advantage of his wolf baby. Scott immediately thought of Jackson. Elsewhere, Derek lured Jackson to an old house in the woods. He hadn't planned to turn Jackson, but to eliminate this troublesome man instead. When Jackson realized the truth, he went limp and begged for mercy, now understanding the terror of werewolves. Not everyone was as kind as Scott. Just as Derek was about to strike, Scott arrived. The two revealed their true forms in front of Jackson, and suddenly an arrow shot through, blinding Scott with a burst of light and striking Derek in the abdomen. Derek drew the enemy's fire to give Scott a chance to escape. Allison, receiving a text from her aunt, grew anxious and indecisive about why Scott hadn't returned yet, unaware that he had collapsed on his way back. Eventually, Allison left the room. When Scott woke up, he found himself surprisingly in a pet hospital where the vet had cured him of poison. On the other side, Allison was taken by Kate to a secret chamber where she decided to reveal the family's secrets. As the iron door opened and Allison entered tentatively, she was prepared for surprises but was still stunned by the monster before her, who got agitated and showed his virgin fangs. It turns out Derek had been captured by the Hunter siblings and taken to their family's private prison. Far from the secret chamber, Allison's thoughts lingered. She realized her family had always been hunting werewolves, but her father had kept it from her. Kate, adding fuel to the fire, said her father was worried she'd be frightened to tears, but she thought Allison had a unique talent. These words sparked Allison's rebellious spirit, and she agreed to join her aunt in hunting werewolves to prove herself to her father. When Scott woke up, his abdominal wound was almost trouble-free. Just then, the doorbell rang. The vet was about to check, but Scott stopped him, sensing the visitor's imposing presence. The vet indicated it was nothing to worry about. Peter came to demand Scott, but the vet firmly refused and sent him away. Pleasantries were useless. Peter immediately turned hostile, but the vet stepped forward, ready to confront him. Only a fence separated them, but Peter was hesitant because of the volcanic ash scattered around, a barrier werewolves could not cross, so he retracted his hand, wary of the old method still remembered by some. The vet's identity was indeed no simple matter. Enraged, Peter grabbed a table and threw it at the vet, who didn't flinch, leaving Peter feeling thwarted and resentful. Before leaving, he used Allison as leverage to threaten Scott. Turning to Derek, he refused to disclose the identity of the Alpha. Crazy Kate tortured him while reminiscing about their past fling 6 years ago. Concerned for Allison's safety, Scott watched over her all night on the rooftop, nearly falling off multiple times due to exhaustion. Later, due to Scott's failing grades, he was disqualified from the winter solstice dance. Thus, he turned to Jackson, hoping he would be Allison's dance partner and protector. Jackson, terrified by the evening's events, wanted no further involvement. Scott realized some people would rather face punishment than honor a toast. So after teaching Jackson a lesson, Jackson obediently asked Allison out. Stiles wanted to be Lydia's dance partner and enlisted Allison's help to persuade her. The trio met in the supermarket where hyperactive Stiles made a spectacle of himself. As Allison was picking out clothes, Peter appeared and struck up a conversation. His nephew had been captured by hunters, so he tried to extract Derek's whereabouts from Allison. Hidden nearby, Scott used the supermarket's PA system to avert the crisis for Allison. Kate consistently ignored her brother's calls because her actions violated the hunter's code. The fire 6 years ago was another transgression when she seduced Derek, and then set fire to a den of werewolves, stirring up past guilt. Derek felt ashamed, but Kate narcissistically suggested that he had been captivated by her at the time. At the dance, Jackson left Allison alone, brooding and drinking. Stiles gathered his courage to ask Lydia to dance. Scott spotted Peter in the crowd, who then vanished. As Scott scanned the room, his gaze met that of the coach, who approached him, grumbling. In a moment of quick thinking, Scott grabbed girly Danny for an emergency embrace. When the coach, poised to make a scene, saw the two men together, he was taken aback. As long as Scott wasn't embarrassed, the embarrassment fell on the coach, who stammered and tried to mask his discomfort with a smile, wary of being labeled homophobic. The coach then encouraged everyone to keep the party lively and keep dancing. After this disruption, Scott was freely able to invite Allison to dance. Jackson stepped outside for some fresh air and unexpectedly spotted 2 red glints in the woods. He gave chase, hoping for a blessing from the Alpha. However, to his embarrassment, the red glints turned out to be a hunter's laser sights. Chris looked at him with a mocking expression, saying he couldn't give him what he wanted, but he had something he needed. Jackson spilled everything. Chris promised not to harm Scott and advised Jackson to go back to dancing and be a normal teenager. Meanwhile, Lydia noticed Jackson was missing and left Stiles to search for her ex-boyfriend. Poor Stiles was heartbroken. However, by a twist of fate, Jackson and Lydia perfectly missed each other. When Jackson returned, he bumped into Stiles, who had not seen Lydia either. Later, Lydia arrived at the sports field searching for someone. Suddenly, the lights blazed on and a tall man approached her. Lydia couldn't see his face clearly. Just then, Stiles warned her from behind, but Peter had already pounced in front of her, revealing his sharp fangs. Lydia fell to the ground bleeding. As Peter was about to strike again, Stiles lunged at him, fighting like he was competing with a wolf for food. Peter used Lydia's life to threaten Stiles, demanding he find Derek's whereabouts. In desperation, Stiles thought of using the GPS on the phone. That night, Derek had covered Scott's retreat, prepared for the possibility of capture, and Scott's phone was missing afterward. Stiles guessed that Derek must have taken Scott's phone, turning the tables on the hunters. On the other side, Allison dragged Scott to the school bus. Suddenly, the scene felt eerily familiar to Scott. It was like a nightmare he once had. Scott wanted to go back, but Allison had already boarded the bus. Just then, 2 cars ambushed them from the front and back. The driver was Allison's father, Chris. Initially confused, Allison then looked at Scott in shock as the 2 vehicles began their assault. Scott's true identity as a werewolf was exposed in front of the girl he adored. Scott fled into the forest, howling like a goose in agony. The facade he'd maintained shattered in that exposed moment. Stiles informed Jackson of Lydia's severe injury and then drove away with Peter, who noticed Stiles's dejection and comfortingly suggested that if Lydia survived, she might become a werewolf, a blessing. Stiles was bitterly sarcastic, lamenting that she would try to rip him in half once a month. However, Peter corrected him by saying that if she's a girl, it's twice a month. Meanwhile, Hunter Chris was furious that Kate had told Allison about the werewolves. Kate argued that Allison's curiosity was too strong, but Chris harshly exposed her, saying it's her who intended to make Allison know their family history. Kate insisted Allison needed to know. Chris asked why Kate had come back. Was it because she hated this town? Kate claimed it was to protect the townsfolk, but Chris saw through her once again, saying she was just satisfying her own lust for killing. Chris demanded that Kate step back and leave town with Allison that night. This man, gentle enough to pick up the pieces when frustrated, was equally unforgiving in his rage. Allison hadn't come out yet, and as her mother packed her clothes, Allison tried to defend Scott, saying he was a good person. But her mother advised her not to be deceived by the hypocrisy of werewolves. Kate, unable to accept the situation, left with Allison. Meanwhile, Chris stayed behind to clean up the mess his sister had made. Scott took refuge in the vet hospital, nursing his broken heart. The tragic love story between a werewolf and a hunter was doomed from the start. Longing to become human again, Scott remembered a legend Derek had mentioned. Killing the alpha who turned him could reverse his own transformation. Amid the howling of pet dogs, Scott devised a plan to find Derek. On another front, Peter had Stiles track Scott's phone to locate Derek. Full of lies, Stiles was given a good talking to. Werewolves can hear the heartbeat of a liar, so Stiles had no choice but to log into Scott's account. Peter was stunned to notice Scott's account password was all about Allison. Stiles asked if he still wanted Scott in his wolf pack. Peter was speechless, wondering what use this lovesick fool is to him. The injured Lydia was rushed to the hospital, and the police were alerted. The sheriff learned from Jackson that only Stiles was present at the scene of the incident. Elsewhere, Scott climbed to the top of Beacon Hills, his howls echoing through the town. The imprisoned Derek heard the call and howled back. They then exchanged many howls rather than kisses. Scott immediately set out, and at the same time, Stiles pinpointed Derek's location. It was under the old house. Hearing the howls, Peter realized he wasn't the only one who knew. Kate, trying to motivate Allison, stayed to hunt werewolves with her. She took her to the hospital to visit the comatose Lydia. Guilt-ridden, Allison fell for her aunt's manipulation, but Kate warned her that werewolves are vicious creatures, including Scott. Peter prepared to head to the old house. Before leaving, he twisted Stiles' car key. A final battle was imminent, and Peter didn't want Stiles to go. Stiles asked if he was planning to silence him here, but Peter replied he was not a completely heartless monster. Stiles challenged him, pointing out that he had become a red-eyed, fanged giant monster. Peter found Stiles' naivety endearing and quite liked him. Since Stiles had helped him, Peter was willing to grant him werewolf powers as a reward. Stiles was shocked, unable to believe what he was hearing. It turned out that during their night in the woods, Peter had initially chosen Stiles, who was taken away by his sheriff father. This led Peter to bite Scott instead. Now he was giving Stiles the choice to have the same power as Scott. No longer just a sidekick, and this power could help him win Lydia back. Stiles remained silent, but his longing was evident in his eyes. Peter was sure of it. No one could refuse the power of a werewolf. The very thing Jackson had desperately sought was now easily within Stiles' reach. Just as Peter was about to bite using his non-virgin fangs, Stiles pulled back his hand, rejecting the offer. Peter was gentle for the first time, showing his fondness for Stiles. Stiles verbally declined, but his heartbeat betrayed him. Werewolves can detect lies, and this action revealed his inner desire. As soon as Stiles regained his freedom, he rushed to the hospital. Lydia had been in a state of shock due to an allergic reaction. Confronted by his father's questions, Stiles again blamed Derek, who had become the ultimate scapegoat. The sheriff speculated that Derek was searching for the woman responsible for the arson 6 years ago, which led to Lydia's attack. Unexpectedly, it was their father who inadvertently resolved the matter. Stiles breathed a sigh of relief and then pressed for details. He learned that the arsonist was a woman nearing her 30s who possessed a pendant engraved with a wolf. Stiles immediately suspected Kate and borrowed a car from Jackson intending to find Scott. However, Chris intercepted him with his men, determined to extract Scott's whereabouts. Chris did not hesitate to get rough with the two young men. Jackson honestly didn't know, but the only one who did, Stiles, was stubbornly tight-lipped. Chris shared his own story, revealing he once had a werewolf friend, as close to him as Scott was to Stiles. However, on a full moon night, the werewolf's ferocity had forced him to face reality, leading him to fatally shoot his friend. Chris hoped his tale would convince Stiles to reveal Scott's location. Instead, Stiles confronted Chris about the arson, asking how he would react if his sister Kate broke the rules. Chris was both shocked and angry. He held rules as his creed, not allowing anyone to overstep. The revelation of his sister committing such a grave crime astonished him. Meanwhile, Scott arrived near the old house and, following the scent, found the entrance to a secret room. Derek had cunningly freed one of his hands and only fought back when Scott arrived. Derek demanded Scott's help to unlock another shackle. However, Scott negotiated conditions, asking him to prevent the Alpha's revenge. Annoyed, Derek insisted on revenge, leaving no room for negotiation. Scott then shared what he had learned from the vet, revealing that Peter had deliberately harmed his sister Laura with a deer trap marked with a whirlwind revenge pattern. Realizing the deception, Derek understood that his vengeful blindness had been exploited by his uncle. As they left the secret room, Derek sensed something was amiss. Everything seemed too easy, and before he could express his suspicion, Scott hastily warned against claiming success too soon, as it often jinxed them. Suddenly, an arrow struck, and Derek fell. Scott was distracted and saw Allison and Kate. Another arrow targeted Derek, while Scott was merely blinded by a flash grenade. The shooter clearly favored Scott, which seemed utterly unfair. Just when the two men had formed an alliance and were ready to act, the Alpha appeared and subdued both women before they could confront him. Scott tried to explain, but Allison no longer trusted him. However, when Kate intended to kill the two men, Allison panicked, realizing she had been manipulated by her aunt. At that moment, Chris arrived and confronted Kate for breaking the rules. The fire had not only killed underage werewolves, but also humans. Chris, filled with a sense of justice and empowered by the rules, demanded that Kate lower her gun. Just then, the door to the old house opened, and the Alpha, having watched the drama unfold, made his move. His speed was incredible, a blur of motion knocking down Chris, Allison, and Scott in succession. Peter targeted only Kate, breaking her arm and dragging her into the old house despite her dead weight. Allison followed urgently and saw the Alpha holding her aunt hostage, critiquing them. Peter told Allison she resembled Kate but perhaps wasn't as cruel. He used Allison's life to force Kate to apologize for murdering his family and the 6 years he suffered from burns and breakdowns. Kate finally apologized, providing some comfort to Peter, who then casually slit her chicken throat. Her insincere apology was evident. At that moment, Scott and Derek positioned themselves around Allison to protect her. The three werewolves engaged in an intense battle. Peter, even without transforming, easily handled the two men. However, under their relentless assault, he finally revealed his true form, a massive figure covered in black fur with blood-red eyes, the hallmark of an Alpha. Scott was blasted out of the house. The two were clearly outmatched. Derek had already given up, and with Chris still unconscious, Scott faced the Alpha alone. Meanwhile, Stiles rushed over and hurled a homemade incendiary bomb, which Peter caught without it shattering or exploding. He roared at Stiles, accusing him of becoming arrogant because of his indulgence. Seizing the moment, Scott tossed the bow and arrows to Allison, who instantly grasped his intent. She drew the bow and shot fluidly. Just as Peter was about to throw a Molotov cocktail, an arrow ignited it. The events unfolded in the blink of an eye. The flames engulfed Peter, who had spent 6 years healing from burns, only to be barbecued like a roasted chicken again. His body was left without a patch of unscathed skin, truly a tragic sight. After this battle, Scott finally won back the heart of Allison. Chris, awakening to this scene, was utterly disheartened. Suddenly, everyone noticed that Derek, who had also awakened, had managed to get in front of Peter. Derek then extended his claws and ended his uncle's revengeful life. Scott then realized he had been used by Derek, realizing the legend that killing the Alpha would turn him back into a human was false. Now Derek emerged as the true victor, now transformed into the new Alpha. Soon after, the police arrived to wrap things up. The sheriff finally confirmed through the pendant that Kate was indeed the arsonist from years ago. Afterward, Scott and Stiles sneaked into the hospital to check on Lydia's condition, discovering that her wounds had not healed and she had not transformed into a werewolf, leaving everyone wondering what mutation had occurred inside her sexy body. On the other side, Jackson arrived at the old house in the dead of night, not to pray this time but to claim his reward. Derek, now an alpha, confronted him with an even more imposing presence and a sinister smile. It seems Jackson will get his wish this time. The news about the murderer, Kate, was out, leaving Chris worried as the family was about to send someone over. The quiet town was about to be stirred up again. Unbeknownst to the couple, Scott was secretly meeting their daughter, Allison. The tragic fate of Peter was deeply regrettable. He too was a victim, merely seeking revenge for his family. Although Derek had transformed into the Alpha, he somehow didn't seem as formidable as his uncle, perhaps due to his many defeats. Kate's death did not put an end to the long-standing feud between the werewolves and the hunters. A stronger and more cunning hunter was about to enter the fray. The transformations of Jackson and Lydia remained uncertain, setting